Dram show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. I think it went down pretty well. Must admit I haven't really looked at the stats, and I think there's a number of comments that I've yet to catch up with, so obviously I'll attempt to do so as soon as possible, but obviously big thank you to everybody that watched it, and yeah, seemed to go down quite nicely. So this week I'm sticking with the whole sort of independent theme that's going on at the moment, I suppose, and looking at the latest Q3 releases from AgniA Whisky Merchants in their Lady of the Glen range. Now, two reasons, I suppose, for doing this episode of the show. Again, like the last episode of the show on Springbank, it's become a bit of a thing, I suppose, a regular thing to do an episode, in actual fact 2 episodes a year over the last couple of years, 3 years I think actually, on Lady of the Glen releases, so kind of keeping up with, you know, the Goodrum show's tradition, I suppose, but also a certain whisky merchant has actually purchased some of these, so it's a bit of a hard sell episode of the show, I suppose. Now, obviously, for those of you that know the history of the channel, this is nothing new. For those of you that don't, the channel was originally conceived, you know, just over 10 years ago, under the umbrella of my employer. So it, you know, it was essentially yeah, sort of an advertising tool, I suppose, for want of a better word, and a few years down the line, one's employer decided that they no longer wished to fund the show, so I kind of took it in-house, I suppose, and it no longer became an advertising channel for my employer. It became my show. But the thing is, of course, that, you know, you can't remove me from my employer, so to speak, you know, although this is not, you know, about what my employer does. I am working for my employer, and so therefore, you know, if you read between the lines essentially at the end of the day, and you know, so obviously independent bottling companies and distilleries, you know, do occasionally send me samples purely just for me to review, but more often than not, as in the case with AgniA Whisky Merchants, there is a commercial side to this. It was send the samples out because obviously they want me to purchase some of the stuff, and obviously I want to purchase some of the stuff so I can sell the stuff to you guys, because, you know, some of the stuff is good stuff. Some of it's not quite so good stuff, it has to be said, but we won't talk about the not so good stuff, shall we say. And so, yeah, you kind of, like I said, you have to sort of read between the lines, and some of the stuff that I review that I really like is going to end up on the shelves in one's employer's shop. And so I make no bones about the fact that some of it does. But this is, like I said, it's not all about sort of one's employer. But like I said, you know, one's employer has purchased these. I have purchased them for one's employer. So I need to bloody well sell them, don't I, at the end of the day? And, you know, so, yes, there isn't, obviously that is part of the reason why I'm doing this episode of the show, because I have purchased some of these bottlings, and like I said, I need to sell them. But, you know, it's always fun to take a look at what AgniA Whisky Merchants are up to each quarter. Lots of finishes. Like I said, in the past, Gregor seems to have become somewhat slightly obsessed with finishing everything in some sort of different wine cask, although not everything, thankfully. There are a few that he's obviously left I was about to say unsullied then, which is not really the correct word, is it? Untouched, I think, is probably a better word to use. But anyway, yeah, I love what they're doing at the end of the day. I love what all the independents are doing. You know, everybody's trying to do something a little bit different, and you know, it's a case of, you know, if you like it, fine. If you don't, then fine. But anyway, one's criteria for purchasing said whiskies always is exactly the same. Is the quality there? Is the balance there? And is there value for money? I mean, and before we sort of get too carried away with the costs of these particular bottlings, they are what they are. We are in, you know, a current situation where whiskey is expensive. There are very little sort of cask strength bottlings now available for what, less than 50 quid. If you can find one, then brilliant. But most of the bottlings now with any sort of bit of age are generally speaking that sort of money. So yes, you might think that's expensive, and of course you have the option to purchase or not to purchase at the end of the day. But anyway, I think that's pretty much enough waffling. Don't really think I've got anything else to add, so let's just take a look at today's lineup. Right, okay, so first of the half dozen samples that I've got in front of me is a 30-year-old North British grain. Always enjoy a bit of grain whiskey, and so single bourbon barrel, 6646, distilled in December of 1992, bottled in July of 2023 at 47.7%, and so as you can see, left in the bourbon barrel, which is quite nice. Nothing like a bit of old grain, so we'll see how that one stacks up. Bottling number 2 is a Glenrothes. Oh yeah, my favourite distillery. Yeah, that all sarcasm. But this has got quite some age to it. It's actually 27 years old. It is again a single refill bourbon hoggy, 4853. So get all of that wonderful Glenrothes distillery character. It's bottled at 51%, was distilled in April of 1996 and bottled in July of 2023. Now, I mean, yes, all right, I'm being a bit facetious. You know what Glenrothes character is like, and it's like with any of these kind of, shall we say, somewhat industrial styles of spirit. If there's a balancing element, whether that's a bit of sweetness, some lovely mature oak, that kind of thing, then you know, so like I said, it is Glenrothes. It is the style. You can't take that away from it, but you can certainly attempt to mitigate some of it, shall we say. Anyway, bottling number 3 is a Glenlossie, 10-year-old Glenlossie, one of the first of the finishes. So this has been ex Oloroso finish, cask number 5308. It was distilled in 2013 and I imagine bottled in July 2023, so 10 years old at 56.6%. And yeah, relatively lightly coloured for an Oloroso finish. So Glenlossie, light, delicate, elegant, can be quite masked by sherry, shall we say? But anyway, we'll see what we get on with that one. Bottling number 4 is a Longmorn. This was originally matured in a refill sherry butt and then finished in an ex-Pedro Ximenez hoggy. Let's see if there's any Longmorn character left after all that sherry. It is 12 years old. It was distilled in April 2011, bottled in July of this year. Cask number 1722, bottled at 58%. And then on for a bit of peat. Always enjoy a bit of peat. So this is a 15-year-old Lochindaal. Now, for those of you that don't know, Lochindaal was a style of spirit that was distilled at Bruichladdich. I think they did it on 2 occasions. They certainly did it in 2007, which is what this is from, and I think they did it again in 2010. Slightly different peating level to Port Charlotte. I forget whether it's higher or lower. I forgot to look that one up. But they've never bottled it themselves as Lochindaal. It's only appeared in the Independents, and according to Hannah Whiskey Merchants, this is the oldest release of Lochindaal. It's a first fill bourbon barrel, 3371, distilled in November of 2007, bottled July of this year, 60.1%. Ooh, that was a bit of a tight cask, it has to be said. Incidentally, I don't know if you remember, but when I first entered the whisky business 20 or odd years ago, the only official bottling of Bruichladdich, because obviously it was closed at the time, was actually called Lochindaal. I think it was a Lochindaal 10 or 12 years old. I wish I'd have kept hold of a bottle of that, because that's probably worth quite a fair amount of money now. But that's just an aside anyway. So yeah, 15-year-old Lochindaal, looking forward to that. And the last bottling of the afternoon is a Tormore. And you're thinking, huh? Why is he doing a Tormore last? That's because it's been finished in ex-Isla Pedro Ximenez octaves, and it's again a 12-year-old, distilled in January 2011, bottled in July of this year. Cask number 1. Now where do these numbers come? Is this cask number 1 from 2011? Because this is certainly not the first ever cask of Tormore. But you know, I often wonder about the cask numberings that independents use. But anyway, so cask number 1, ex-Isla Pedro Ximenez octave finish. Are we going to get any Tormore character there whatsoever? Well, we'll find out at the end, won't we? Anyway, so that's this afternoon's lineup. Well, actually, it's not quite afternoon yet. Ooh, brew for breakfast. So let's kick off with a bit of North British, shall we? Right. Okay. So let's see what the nose gives us on the North British end, then, shall we? That's a lovely nose. As you know, big fan of grain. Okay. Doesn't quite have, say, the complexity per se of a malt, but it's got that lovely, slightly rummy sort of dried fruit, lighter dried fruit, so sort of dried apples, sultana, apricot, that kind of thing. Lovely sort of column still nip, nice freshness, touch of vanilla, little bit of mature oak, a little bit of sawdust. I mean, not as much sort of mature oak as some grains that I've tasted, but beautifully balanced in my opinion. And again, the thing is, right, this is a 30-year-old grain whiskey, and it's hitting the shelves at 123 quid. Now, for a 30-odd-year-old spirit, just forget that there's a grain whiskey from it, it's still bloody good value for money. I mean, the next bottling, the Glenrothes, is considerably more expensive. So if you're just looking at bang for your buck, you know, this is great. This is really good, and like I said, might not have the complexity of a 30-year-old single malt, but it's got an awful lot going on. Lovely. Super pads on. Classic grain. Lovely. Lovely balance of sweet and sour on the palate. Getting sort of sweeter dried fruits, sort of apricots, a little bit of banana, unsweetened pineapple, citrus, a little bit of oak. Oak has a nice level of creaminess, comes through on the mid palate. And then back we go to the spirit character on the finish. A little bit more of that sort of rummy dried fruit, ginger. And again, that sort of column still spicy freshness is, you know, continuous throughout there, and that's what I love about old grain whiskies. That lovely sort of crisp column still character. Obviously, when they're very young, they are very, you know, simple and straightforward, and they need the time in the oak to pick up the oak character, to add some complexity, and you know, that is absolutely gorgeous. Again, like I said, it's a 30-year-old spirit. Might not quite have the complexity of a 30-year-old single malt, but you're paying probably half the price of more than half, I would say, the price of a 30-year-old single malt. So if you love mature spirits, that's a really good one to go for. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Glenrothes. So 27 years old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Yeah, it's Glenrothes. It's classically sort of hard spey character. It's hard barley, it's green gauge, gooseberry, bit of malt, underripe fruit, green fruit. It's pretty hard going, it has to be said. There's a little bit of oak, not a huge amount, and I'm not really getting a huge amount of sweetness, just kind of offset that sort of green fruit. It's not quite astringent. I mean, that's the thing, the time has kind of removed some of that astringency. I mean, there is a little bit of sweeter citrus coming out, a little bit of possibly tangerine, possibly a little bit of honey, some chalk, I mean, it is what it is at the end of the day. It is a 27-year-old Glenrothes, and it's either a style of spirit that you like or you don't. And I'm just not that much of a fan of it, to be honest with you. And then you think, well, I'm having to retail this for £235 a bottle, and I'm not saying it's not worth that. I'm just saying that if somebody came along and said, I've got £235 burning a hole in my pocket and I would not want to buy a whiskey, this is not the first one that I would grab, shall we say. And that's just a personal preference. Like I said, some people love this kind of hard, space-eyed character. For me, yeah, it doesn't float my boat. Anyway, let's see what comes out. There's a little bit more sweetness on the palate initially, a little bit more mature oak, a little bit more honey, and so the balance is actually quite pleasant to sort of start off with, but that sweetness kind of dissipates fairly quickly onto the mid palate as that green fruit, the gooseberry, the green gage, green apple kind of comes through. Finishes with a little bit of toffee, a little bit of toasted nut, a little bit of spice. I mean, it's got a good progression, can't argue with that. Kicking off with some sweetness, moving into the distillery character, and sort of some oak coming back on the finish. So good cask of whiskey. You know, if you look at it in sort of isolation, I suppose. If I was judging this without knowing what the distillery was, I would judge this quite highly, because it has balance, it has complexity, and it has progression. Putting aside all of that, it's, again, like I said, it's not a style I really enjoy, but this is, sort of the thing. When you judge a whiskey, you kind of, to a certain extent, put your likes and dislikes to one side and just purely judge the spirit on what it actually is. And like I said, in this instance, I think it's a very, very good bottling. Don't particularly enjoy it, wouldn't want to sell it, but it's still good at the end of the day. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Glenlossie. I must admit, it kind of I'm always a little bit wary of these types of whiskies, these sort of light, elegant, delicate whiskies, whether they're Spays or Lowlands or what have you, and they've been finished, and you sort of think, oh, why, and I would say at least sort of 7 out of 10 times, you come away thinking, well, the finish is a bit too heavy. But anyway, let's see what the nose gives on this. I quite like this. It's, yeah, all right, okay, so I'm getting that kind of boiled sweet sherry, that sort of style of sherry that I sometimes get with Penderyn, that sort of, boiled confectionery sort of sweet sherry. But loads of tropical fruit. I mean, now, to be fair, Glenlossie is not exactly particularly a tropical spirit, it has to be said. So this interaction of cask and spirit has actually done it an awful lot of favours, I think. There's a little bit of treacle, some lime, praline, a little bit of sweet raisinated fruit, some dried grape, black grape, a little of that sort of spayy green fruit, a little bit of green apple, gooseberry. I kind of quite like this. Unfortunately, so did a lot of the people, and I didn't get a chance to actually buy any of it, which is a bit of a shame. So I have no idea what the selling price of this is. I'm sure it's online somewhere. Yeah, I like that. Let's see what the pounds are. Oh yeah, you can tell that's 56%. A little bit more sherry on the palate. There's a little bit more dry sort of spices and tannins. But there's a nice softness there, some toffee, a little bit of chocolate as well. Little less of the exuberant sort of tropical fruit that I found on the nose. There is a little bit there, it has to be said. There's a little bit of barley. Like I said, quite masked. A little bit of fleshy banana, green apple on the finish. Yeah, okay. I love the nose. I'm less kind of blown away by the palate, it has to be said. Although I still think relatively well balanced. Let's put a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it. Now that certainly has kind of diminished the sherry quite a bit on the nose. Not that there was a huge amount there to start off with. So we're more of the sort of like unsweetened pineapple, apricot, slightly freshy fruits, coffee, toffee and barley. Yeah, I like the nose. I think the nose is really very, very appealing. Let's see what the palate's like now. Yeah, better balance on the palate as well now. Less of the sherry impact. It's kind of pushed to the edges, shall we say. And again, it's come out quite fleshy, which is slightly unusual for Glenlossie. I don't find it that kind of rich and fruity. It's, you know, a lot more sort of fresher and but this has actually like I said, really drawn out some great weight of fruit. And it's a lovely palate now. The balance is considerably better. Less sherry, more distillery character. A bit of an outlier, it has to be said. And again, this is sort of like what again plays into the belief that certain distilleries, you know, get shot of casks that don't necessarily meet their flavour profile. And sometimes, I mean, I'd have been quite happy to drink that, you know, just as a, you know, aged in American oak. Although, you know, the sherry has added an extra element to it, which again is the whole point of finishing. And, you know, you don't want it to completely mask everything. You want it to add a nuance. And I think that Hannah Whiskey Merchants have done a really nice job with it. I think this is a very, very good bottling, and I can see why why it sold so quickly. Right, okay, so let's move on to the double sherried Longmorn then. So initially aged in a refill sherry butt before being finished in a PX Hoggy. Okay, let's see what nose gives us. Yes, there's a lot of sherry. It's interesting. I mean, there's some high-toned sherry notes, there's some herbal sherry notes, there's a touch of treacle. And beneath that, you get the kind of Longmorn feel, shall we say. I've always kind of had Longmorn in that sort of similar kind of style to kind of Glen Grant, that kind of very upright and sort of, you know, focused, I suppose, for want of a better word, malty, upright, sort of traditional, but not traditional in a kind of negative connotation traditional, if you see what I mean. And yes, there is a lot of sherry here, but there is a little bit of spey notes coming through, a little bit of that green fruit, a little bit of gooseberry again, a little bit of toasty oak. Now, yeah, I kind of quite like this, it has to be said. I think it works. Now, whether you think £119 is what you'd be prepared to spend on a 12-year-old, and the trouble is, of course, there's not very much Longmorn about. I mean, it used to be a lot more available, shall we say. It used to appear in a lot more independent bottlers lists than it does these days. So, probably a privately bought cask, I imagine, coming to market. Hence why it's quite expensive. Let's see what pass on. Again, quite a lot of treacle, toasted oak, dark fruits, a little bit malt. Again, it's got that lovely upright kind of character, that maltiness. and it's just just got a lovely structure to it. It is a bit heavy on the sherry, I will give you that. But I do get some barley, some citrus, and a lovely maltiness. Like I said, a really lovely structured whiskey. A little mast, a little bit of lovely sort of spicy notes right on the aftertaste. I love the way the sort of the treacle note kind of like starts off quite prominent and then just glides to a sort of like a finish. It just appeals to me. I mean, it's, you know, on paper, you know, you look at it and you think it's probably not going to be sort of a whiskey that I'm particularly fond of. But then again, you know, there's always a difference between on paper and the reality of the situation. I'm going to put a little drop of water with it and see what that does. Okay, so not quite so high tone now. Again, sherry has taken a little bit of a diminishing. I mean, considering, you know, it's been wholly aged in sherry, it's, you know, quite surprising that it's a little drop of water has mitigated it quite so much. So I'm getting, again, a lot more of that sort of upright, malty, barleyed kind of character, you know, that sort of kind of classic sort of Longmorn, sort of Glenrothes-y sort of style. Nice and nutty as well now, really quite nuts. I'm getting grilled, almost walnut, pecan, no, not pecan, pecan's a bit too sweet. Yeah, walnut, sort of, maybe a little bit of almond. So that's like that. Palate likewise. Again, the sherry notes lessened to a certain degree, more distillery character, more sort of upright, sort of malty, barley. Again, has that lovely traditional feel to it. It's very old-fashioned, almost like a throwback kind of whiskey. And you know, it's not that traditional, like I said, with regards to sort of styles of whiskey like Glenrothes, Glenfarclas, etc., etc., etc. It is in that kind of Glengrant-y kind of sort of area, should we say. It's not obviously identical to Glengrant, but Glengrant again is another one of those sort of like, you know, very old-fashioned styles of whiskey, very upright, very sort of Victorian, shall we say. I mean, you know, whenever I sort of see Glengrant, I always think of curly moustaches, but then I think that's because old Colonel Glengrant, or whatever his name was, had a twirly moustache, I think. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here. Let's move on. Let's just basically say that is a lovely sherry whiskey, and I don't say that very often. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Lochindaal. So 15 years old, 60.1%. I imagine this is probably going to need a little drop of water, but anyway, let's see what the note is. That's lovely. Sweet barley. I mean, that's just this is the wonderful thing about peated Bruichladdich. Even though, you know, they peat it to death on certain occasions, you still get the barley, you still get the Bruichladdich character. And I'm thinking, you know, how? I mean, you know, other distilleries, you know, that were peated to this kind of level, and you just would not get you know, an iota of distillery character. But you know, here it is. It's got that sweet barley, rich apricot fruit, banana, apple, creamy oak, pepper, gentle earthy peat, and a little bit of fish, some menthol. Not hugely coastal. Again, another one of those casks that's probably spent, I would guess, at least half of its life, I would have thought, on the mainland. I mean, there is a little bit of saltiness, a little bit of coastal. I mean, it's just gorgeous. It is sublime, and you know, you just sort of like go, no weird cast finishes, no mucking about with it. Leave it in a bourbon barrel, 15 years, bottle it. You know, this is what you get. Now, you're gonna have to pay for this. It is 190 odd quid, and you're probably going, oh my word, but you're paying for the rarity factor. You're paying for the rarity factor, and you are getting a stunning whiskey, it has to be said. Absolutely stunning. There's no doubt about it. It's worth every penny. I mean, you know, as long as you can afford that. I mean, if you've got, you know, far more bloody spare cash than I ever will have, then yeah. But yeah, I'm on the shelf. No questions. You know, it's kind of like one of those sort of almost no-brainers. You know, every bottle of Lochindaal I've ever tasted, and I've tasted a huge amount of them, it has to be said, has been absolutely spot on. So you see it, you think, yeah, that's pretty much going to be spot on. Unlikely to come across a bad one is what I'm basically saying. Anyway, let's see what the pound's like. That alcohol is so well integrated. Yes, it is masking the finish, but it's not ripping your head off. I mean, even though it's 60-odd%. Again, opens with that lovely sweet barley, honeysuckle, plenty of Bruichladdich character, fresh apricot, apple, possibly a little bit more coastal on the palate, lovely pepperiness, dry, earthy peat, maybe a smidge of medicinal notes, a little bit of bog myrtle possibly, but it's predominantly dry, dusty peat. It's a little bit of violet, lovely sweetness. The sweetness just keeps continuously through the palate. Beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. Even though the finish has kind of chopped off a little bit because of the alcohol, the aftertaste is just going on and on and on. I mean, that is just stunningly good. I mean, it really is a beautiful whiskey. And let's put a little drop of water and hope to God it doesn't fall apart. No, it doesn't. Don't even know why I bothered saying that, but anyway, more citrus now. Lime, yeah, definitely some lime. A little bit more coastal notes, a little bit more salt, more barley, slightly sweeter oak, slightly less complex, I would say, with water, but it's a little bit more sweeter. There's a little bit more sweetness to the fruit, not quite sugary sweetness. I wouldn't quite go as far as saying confected sweetness, but yeah, honeyed sweetness, very much honeyed sweetness. That sort of, you know, when you get that kind of thick set honey and that sort of little bit of crystallized sugar on the top, that's the sort of like natural sweetness, I suppose. Anyway, let's see what that's like. Oh, that's succulent, that's juicy, that's gorgeous. More honeysuckle, more classic Bruichladdich character, apple, apricot. Peat is quite lessened, by quite a fair degree in actual fact. It's now just a sort of a wisp, and a touch of loamy earthiness, lovely. I mean, personally, I think I prefer it neat. I prefer the sort of the intensity. I prefer the sort of, I think it has more complexity when it's neat, but certainly putting a little drop of water with it, like I said, softens it, lengthens it, compromises the peat a little to a certain extent. But either way, that is a stunning whiskey, absolutely stunning. My heart is broken in two. Can't you see it's real? Right, okay, so let's move on to the 12-year-old ex-Islay PX Octave Finish Tormore. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Any Tormore character there? No, none whatsoever. I mean, those are Islay Octaves, my God, they really are just incredible. I mean, it's just sort of like, you know, big, meaty, toasty, dark fruits, herbal peat, dusty peat, more smoked meat. I mean, this has got astringent coastal notes. I mean, this is more coastal than the Lochindaal, and you know, yet, you know, probably hasn't even anywhere been near the coast. It's intense. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's fun. No Tormore whatsoever. Could be any bloody whiskey. Could be from any distillery. Now, here's the thing. 75 quid. Yeah, it's all right. 75 quid. Calm down. But you know what? Yeah, that's a whole load of fun. If you like kind of like, you know, peat and sherry, then you're going to absolutely kill for this. I mean, it's just great. Absolutely wonderful. I mean, like I said, you know, do not expect any Tormore character whatsoever, but expect a whole load of fun. Let's see what that's like. Oh, you can taste that 57%, I can tell you that for a start. And that's a weird thing, isn't it, when you think about it? You know, the Bruichladdich 60% and slightly masked, you know, no real issue at all. This 57%, and yeah, you can really taste the alcohol. Anyway, it's kind of quite dusty, it's quite earthy peat, a little bit of menthol, gritty tannins, a touch of tar, treacle. Again, like I said, no Tormore character, loads of peat, loads of fun, intensity off the scale, it has to be said. Green fruit, seaweed, creosote, and quite a bit of salt as well, chucked in for good measure. Less meaty actually. The palate doesn't quite have the sort of like the roasted meat character that the nose had, but yeah, that's intense. You know you've had some of that. That's all I can say. And like I said, you know, when you look at the prices of the other whiskies in, you know, you just think 75 quid. It's actually pretty bloody good. Almost a bargain. But not quite. But okay, so it's just kind of pushing back again against some of the Islery PXE sort of notes. I am getting a smidgen of barley, just a smidgen. I am kind of looking for it, but I guess with this particular whiskey, it doesn't really matter whether it has any distillery character or not. You're buying it because you want a sort of like a funky whack of, you know, sherry and peat, basically. And I mean funky in a good way as opposed to funky in a kind of like, you know, not so good way. So what the power's like. I actually get some fruit now. I actually get maybe some Tormore character. A little bit of sort of pineapple, apricot. Less of the sort of like the peatiness, it's still definitely there, but there's a sweetness now there. I like it either way, actually. Maybe it's not. Anyway, I like it with or without water, I think is probably the better way of saying it. And yeah, that's kind of a whole load of fun. It's great value. I think in the current sort of, you know, pricing structure of you know, cask strength bottled whiskies, I think, you know, that's really good. And if you like a sort of like a good dollop of peat and sherry, then you can't go wrong with that. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to Paul McKendrick from Hannah Whisky Merchants for the samples for today's episode of the show, and to everybody at Hannah Whisky Merchants for their continued support. That's very, very much appreciated. So, Q3's bottlings, I think, on the whole, pretty good. You know, I love the North British. As you know, I love old grain whiskies, and I thought that really ticked the box for an old grain whiskey. Not as oaky as some old grains that I've come across, but, you know, really, really nicely balanced. And I didn't think the Glenrothes was bad at all. I mean, it is what it is. You know, you know what the style of Glenrothes is like. There were some offsetting notes, I suppose, a little bit of oak, maybe not that much. Certainly on the nose, it was very, very much Glenrothes as usual. Whether it's really worth 235 quid, of course, is open to debate. But I thought the quality was pretty good, so I couldn't argue with that. Glenlossie, I mean, that was a whole bundle of fun at the end of the day. I mean, you know, I really wasn't expecting to get any kind of fruitiness out of that whatsoever, and you know, it had it, you know, so you can't argue that the finish was actually, you know, quite sort of balanced at the end of the day. And to a certain extent, the Longmorn was quite well balanced as well. For other reasons, the fact that the character of the spirit is kind of stands up to the sherry, and when you think about the amount of sherry that was chucked at it, it's done a bloody good job of withstanding it. And so yes, very traditional. Don't see it very often, unfortunately, these days. Longmorn. Yes, it's a bit pricey, but you know, that's the current reality of the situation. The Lochindaal, well, I mean, if you can afford it, buy it. It's bloody good. Loved it. Nothing else to say about that. And to a certain extent, the Tormore. Then, yeah, put a little drop of water with it, you might get a little bit of Tormore character. But generally speaking, it's peat, it's sherry, it's a whole load of fun, and it's relatively cheap. He says that, you know, with a large emphasis on the relatively. Anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. I thought it was a great deal of fun. So not quite sure what next week's going to entail, but I think it's going to be interesting, whatever the hell happens. Anyway, until then, good afternoon, and well, it's almost afternoon, so almost afternoon, and good dramming.
Yes, darling.